Hello and welcome to Unleash Opportunities, Digital Companies in Malta under Vision 2050. Malta's Vision 2050 is a game changer with digital transformation at its core, opening doors for digital firms across sectors. In the next 60 minutes, we will explore how you can tap into those opportunities, from e-government services to AI to high-end manufacturing and more. Enjoy!
All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty massive, this Malta Vision 2050 thing. Have you had a chance to look it over?
Yeah, definitely had a good read through it. It's ambitious.
It is ambitious, like 25 years out. That's a long, long time to be thinking ahead.
Right, and it's not just some pie in the sky wish list either. They've really tried to ground it in what's happening now and what's likely to come down the road. You know, all those global trends everyone keeps talking about.
Yeah, and that healthy quality of life for everyone. Bit that's front and center, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the heart of it for sure. That's like the big picture goal that all the rest of it kind of flows from.
So what stood out to you most when you were going through it?
Honestly, the scope of it, they didn't just make this up in a vacuum. They looked at a ton of existing strategies, over 30, they said, and thousands of individual initiatives.
Yeah, they reviewed over 1,800, they said, and narrowed it down to 90 big ones?
Yeah, something like that. It's a lot of information to process. That's why I'm glad we're doing this deep dive, breaking it down a bit,
Exactly, because who has time to read through all that, right? But let's back up a sec. Why even bother with a 25-year vision in the first place?
Well, the world's changing pretty fast, isn't it?
Okay.
You've got climate change, digital, everything, geopolitical stuff that's unpredictable. It makes sense to try and get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, the Prime Minister's forward really hammered that point home. They need to be bold and think long term.
Exactly. And it's not just about reacting to those challenges either. It's about shaping Malta's future proactively. What do they want the country to look like in 25 years? What kind of society do they want to build?
And it seems like they're moving away from that old idea of just measuring progress by how much money the country makes.
Definitely. They're talking about going beyond GDP. It's not enough to just have economic growth. They want to make sure that translates into a better quality of life for everyone. Things like good education, a healthy environment, a fair and inclusive society.
All the things that actually matter to people in their daily lives, right? Not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. And it's interesting because when they did those public consultations, those themes came up a lot. People are proud of Malta. They have a strong sense of national identity, but they're also worried about things like overdevelopment, the cost of housing, the cost of living in general,
So they want progress, but they don't want to lose what makes Malta unique.
That's the balance they're trying to strike. And it's not just older generations either. The younger folks, they're really focused on quality of life too.
Yeah. What were some of the things that stood out in the feedback from the 18 to 34 group?
Well, they're definitely concerned about practical stuff like, traffic and public services, but they also want a good work-life balance. They care about Malta's social and cultural scene, the restaurants, the nightlife, the arts and culture scene. It's important to them.
So they want to be able to enjoy life, not just work all the time, right? Makes sense.
Yeah, and the business community had some interesting things to say, too.
What were their main takeaways?
They recognize Malta's strengths, like its agility, the pro-business environment, that quality of life we were talking about. But they also had some concerns,
Look what?
Skill shortages came up a lot, and the dependence on foreign labor infrastructure capacity was another big one. And then there's the whole governance issue, is the government efficient enough? Can it keep up with the pace of change?
So they're basically saying, yeah, Malta's got potential, but it needs to step up its game.
Exactly. And they want a long-term vision that they can believe in something that goes beyond short-term political cycles, something stable and reliable that they can plan around and invest in.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how did they actually go about creating this vision? Who was involved and what was the process?
Well, it was spearheaded by the Office of the Prime Minister with the Ministry for the Economy, Enterprise, and Strategic Projects taking the lead. They also brought in some international experts, people who've done this kind of long-term planning before,
So they had some outside help to get things going.
Right. And to make sure it wasn't just one ministry doing its own thing, they set up an interministerial steering committee to coordinate everything, you get everyone on the same page.
So they had a team, a big team working on this.
Yeah, a good team. And they started by doing a deep dive into everything that was already happening. They looked at over 30 sectoral strategies that were already in place. All those plans for different parts of the economy and society.
So they did their homework, basically.
Yeah, they really did. And they went through over 1,800 individual initiatives that were either underway or planned.
Wow, that's a lot to sift through.
It was a huge undertaking, but they managed to boil it all down to about 90 key, what they call macro initiatives, like the big picture stuff that all the other initiatives feed into.
Okay, so they had a good grasp of what was already happening internally, but what about the external factors, the global trends we were talking about earlier?
They looked at that too. They identified 15 major global macro trends that are likely to have a big impact on Malta going forward.
Like what kind of trends?
Well, everything from technological advancements like artificial intelligence and the whole digitalization thing to economic shifts, the green economy, the changing landscape of global trade, and then you've got demographic changes and the whole climate change issue. Those are all major forces that they had to take into account.
Makes sense to consider the big picture, right? And then they did all those consultations we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, they went all out on that. Public surveys, industry, roundtables, meetings with all sorts of stakeholders, trade unions, employers associations, civil society groups, you name it.
So they really tried to get input from everyone.
They did. They even consulted with the opposition party, which is interesting, trying to get some bipartisan buy-in.
And what about young people? Did they get a chance to weigh in?
Oh, yeah. They had a whole dedicated session with the Youth Advisory Forum. Got to hear from the next generation.
Okay, so they gathered all this information. They looked at what was already happening. They considered the global context. They talked to everybody. What did they do with all that?
Well, they came up with this vision for Malta's future, and they structured it around 4 main pillars, kind of like the 4 cornerstones of where they want to go.
What are those 4 pillars?
So the first one is sustainable economic growth. But it's not just growth for growth's sake. They're talking about quality over quantity, focusing on sectors that provide high value and are sustainable in the long term.
So, like, what kind of sectors are we talking about?
Well, they specifically mention financial services, particularly things like fintech and wealth management, aviation, with a focus on increasing commercial activity and aircraft registration tourism. But with a shift towards attracting higher spending visitors, the digital and gaming industries, research and innovation, including high-end manufacturing like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, smart construction, sustainable building practices and infrastructure, and the shipping and maritime industries.
That's a pretty diverse mix. It seems like they're trying to cover all their bases.
Yeah, they're not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And then the second pillar is accessible citizen-centered services, basically making sure everyone has access to high-quality essential services, things like healthcare, education, transportation, the stuff that affects people's daily lives.
So it's about making sure the benefits of growth are shared by everyone.
Exactly. And then the third pillar is resilient country and modern education system. This is all about making Malta more adaptable to future shocks, whether it's economic, environmental, or whatever. And a big part of that is modernizing the education system so people have the skills they need to succeed in a changing world.
And the fourth pillar?
Smart land and sea usage. This one's pretty self-explanatory, given that Malta's an island. Space is limited, so they need to be smart about how they use it both on land and at sea, and they're being very cautious about things like land reclamation, making sure it's done sustainably and for the right reasons.
Okay, so those are the 4 pillars, but they also identified some key enablers, things that need to be in place for the whole thing to work, right?
Exactly. They're like the foundation, the groundwork that everything else depends on.
So what are they?
Well, one of the big ones is adaptive, inclusive, and data-driven policy and governance. Basically, they're saying the government needs to be more agile, more responsive to change, more inclusive in its decision-making, and more data-driven, using evidence to make better policies.
So basically more modern 21st century government.
Exactly. And then another key enabler is a strong Malta brand, really promoting Malta's identity as a nation that's innovative, environmentally responsible, and a provider of high-quality goods and services.
It's got to stand out in the global marketplace, right?
Exactly. The other 2 enablers are about strengthening Malta's national identity and fostering a culture of innovation across society.
Yeah.
But those first 2 on governance and branding, they're really crucial for everything else to fall into place.
Okay. And they set some pretty ambitious targets too, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They're aiming high. For example, they want Malta to be in the top 20 of the Human Development Index by 2035 and in the top 10 by 2050.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It is. They're also targeting a significant increase in median disposable income by 2050. They want it to be 135% of the EU average.
So basically making sure people have more money in their pockets.
Exactly. And they're not just focused on the material stuff either. They also want Malta to be among the top 5 EU countries in terms of overall life satisfaction, how happy people are with their lives.
So it's about well-being, not just wealth.
Exactly. That's the overarching theme here. All right, so let's dig a little deeper into some of those key sectors they highlighted, starting with tourism. How are they going to make that shift to a more premium offering?
Yeah, because they're not just talking about getting more tourists, they're talking about getting more high-spending tourists, right?
Right. The idea is to attract visitors who spend more per night and contribute more to the local economy. They've actually set a target for average tourist expenditure per night to be between 275 and 285 by 2035.
That's quite a bit higher than it is now.
It is. So they're going to have to develop more high-quality attractions, things like conferences, festivals, exhibitions that appeal to those higher-spending travelers. They also want to expand the availability of premium accommodations, more 4- and 5-star hotels, and just generally improve the whole tourism ecosystem with better quality restaurants, tours, and services.
So basically making Malta a more exclusive destination.
Yeah, something like that. And they also see potential in growing Malta as a home port for cruise lines, so that's another avenue they're exploring.
Okay, so tourism's one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
What about the gaming industry? How are they going to maintain their leadership position there?
Well, it's all about reinforcing Malta's reputation as a well-regulated hub, a place where gaming companies can operate with confidence. They're aiming for steady growth of 5-6% per year, which is pretty healthy, and they see a lot of potential in the digital content creation and video gaming subsectors, so they might offer some incentives to attract those kinds of companies.
Interesting. And what about financial services? What's their plan there?
They want to attract more international investment funds, wealth management firms, fintech companies, the kind of businesses that bring in a lot of capital and create high-paying jobs. And they're talking about streamlining regulations, making it easier to do business in Malta, attracting top talent from overseas, making it a more attractive destination for financial services professionals.
So kind of a one-stop shop for financial services?
Yeah, that's the goal. And then there's aviation. They've got some pretty aggressive growth targets for that sector.
Yeah, I think I saw something like a 13% annual growth rate. That's huge.
It is. So they're talking about increasing commercial flight activity, aircraft registration, expanding maintenance, repair, and overhaul services, making Malta a hub for aviation in general. And they want to establish more long-haul direct flights to major international airports so you can get to Malta more easily from anywhere in the world.
So basically making Malta more connected to the global economy.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about the economic side of things. What about that third pillar, resilient country and modern education system? What are some of the key initiatives there?
Yeah, because it seems like education's a big focus.
It is. They're planning a major overhaul of the curriculum to make it more relevant to the 21st century. More emphasis on STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and they want to strengthen vocational training pathways so people can get the skills they need for the jobs that are actually in demand.
So making sure education keeps pace with the changing economy.
Exactly. And then on the energy front, they're talking about enhancing Malta's connections to regional energy grids so they're not so reliant on just one source of energy, and they're pushing hard for renewable energy, solar, wind power, the whole green energy thing.
And what about the environment? Because Malta's a small island, so they have to be careful about that.
Absolutely. They're talking about restoring and protecting ecosystems, increasing biodiversity, implementing measures to achieve carbon neutrality, all the things you'd expect.
So a holistic approach to resilience?
Exactly. And then you've got those cross-cutting themes like national identity and good governance. Why are those so important?
Yeah, because they're kind of the glue that holds everything together, right?
Exactly. A strong sense of national identity. It gives people a shared purpose, a sense of belonging, and it makes them more likely to buy into this long-term vision. It's not just some abstract plan. It's about building a better future for Malta and for Maltese people.
And good governance, that's about making sure the government is effective, efficient, and accountable to the people, right?
Exactly, because if people don't trust the government, if they don't believe the government is acting in their best interest, then the whole thing falls apart.
So they're saying good governance is essential for building trust and legitimacy.
Exactly. All right, so we've talked about the vision, we've talked about the pillars, we've talked about the enablers. What about the roadmap? How are they actually going to put all this into action?
Yeah, because it's one thing to have a plan, it's another thing to actually execute it.
All right. Well, they've got a phased implementation plan that stretches all the way to 2050 with specific milestones along the way, check-ins to see if they're on track. And they're prioritizing the initiatives that are likely to have the biggest impact in the short term while also laying the groundwork for the longer term stuff.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're very clear that this vision It's not meant to replace all the existing sectoral strategies. It's meant to provide an overarching framework that brings everything together, make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction.
Okay, so it's about alignment and coordination.
Exactly. And they're also realistic. They know that things are going to change along the way, so they're emphasizing the need to be flexible, to adapt the plan as needed. It's not set in stone.
So they're building in some wiggle room?
Yeah, exactly. And they're really stressing that this is a national endeavor. It's not just the government's responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility, businesses, civil society, individual citizens. Everyone needs to play their part if they want this vision to succeed.
Mm-hmm. So they're calling for collective ownership.
Exactly. And they end by saying that achieving this vision, it's going to require ambition, consistency, and courage, the courage to make tough decisions and to stick with it, even when things get difficult.
Well said. So to sum up, Malta Vision 2050 is a bold, ambitious plan to create a better future for Malta. A future where quality of life is paramount, where the economy is strong and sustainable, where the country is resilient to future challenges, and where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. And it's backed by a really comprehensive plan with clear targets, specific initiatives, and a phased implementation roadmap. So it's not just talk, it's a serious commitment to making this vision a reality.
And it's a fascinating case study in long-term strategic planning. It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds over the next 25 years.
It will. I'm curious to see what kind of impact it has on Malta and on other countries that might be looking to do something similar. Maybe this could be a model for other small nations that are trying to chart their course in a rapidly changing world.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for you to ponder. What do you think is the single most important factor that will determine the success or failure of Malta Vision 2050? And what role can individual citizens play in making it a success?
That's a good question, and it's one that I think every Maltese citizen should be asking themselves, because ultimately the success of this vision, it depends on the people of Malta.
Well said. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into Malta Vision 2050. It's been a great conversation.
It has. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.